Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the RSM Professional Support webinar. We've got a really interesting and important topic for you guys today. We're going to be looking at cyber risk and cyber fraud. So obviously that's going to be important for you personally, for your businesses, and of course for your clients as well. Unfortunately, in the last year or so, as we've been within the global pandemic, we have seen an increased threat from cyber crime, identity fraud and data breaches as criminals have looked to take advantage of our lives becoming more and more digitalized. I know personally I've seen a lot more kind of fraudulent scam emails, etc., coming from people pretending to be HMRC, and I'm quite often asked, is this a genuine communication? So Sheila and her team, they've been incredibly busy over the last year, helping a large number of businesses across a wide range in dealing with this increased threat. So I'll be back at the end as usual to do a quick Q&A session. So as we go along, please do type in your questions to the Q&A box there on the screen. Try not to type in the chat box, as that won't go to us as panelists, it will go to everyone. We might miss that at the end, which we wouldn't want to do. So before I hand over to Sheila and the guys to introduce themselves, just for anyone who doesn't know me, my name's Justin Stevenson. I'm a Tax Investigations Associate Director. I'm based in RSM's Guildford office. And working in tax investigations, I have the privilege of working with loads of RSM specialists across a wide range of areas. So if you do have any weird, wonderful questions that you're not quite sure who to ask, then do direct them to me and I will be able to find the right person to help you out with that. And on that note, I shall now hand you over to one of those specialists, Sheila.
Morning all, morning Justin, thank you for that, that's fantastic. We're really excited to run this session with you today. As Justin mentioned, we've got a number of our specialists with us from our teams. So Gemma, who is a director in our fraud risk services team, and Richard, who works very closely with me on the cyber side and is very much one of our cyber specialists. Thank you, Bella. So just in terms of a little bit of introduction, I lead our technology risk assurance practice across the UK. I'm a partner here. I also sit on what is called our cyber task force, which is basically a team of specialist partners. We are responsible for, in effect, managing what we call the cyber threat landscape for our clients globally. So basically based in various regions across the world. We all work very closely together across our RSM member network, making sure that we're providing the right advice and guidance to our clients, and in particular giving them a view on, what does this evolving technology risk landscape look like. So if you look at this slide, what we have here is a view of what the landscape currently is, and as you can see, it's becoming very complex, and even more so complex since the onset of the pandemic. So what we have now is obviously a huge use of big data and analytics. We've got increased mobile working, particularly with remote working, now that we're all working in our home environments and not necessarily in our corporate environments. We've also got the Internet of Things. Some of you might or might not be familiar with this term, quite often referred to as IoT. And this is basically technology that's built into lots of devices. So things like your Ring doorbell, your satellite navigation system, we've got Alexa, we've got various heating systems and other things that can be managed remotely. All of them have got these IoT devices built into them. Internet transactions, I'm sure you'll be extremely familiar with. Obviously, we've now got real-time access to our banking applications. When you use your credit card, whether that's contactless or via a machine, basically, you're being told immediately, in effect, what that transaction is, what's happened, how it's taken place, where it's taken place, what it relates to. So again, some very powerful applications out there that we have access to. We've got social media, of course, we've got social media, pretty much drives everyday life now. Huge increase in use of social media across all age groups as well, which is really quite interesting. I think when you look at sort of the demographic now of the use of social media via apps, via Facebook and Twitter and various other things, it's really quite a very broad demographic. Cloud computing is becoming increasingly popular. So what we generally see in technology, I mean, I've been in technology risk for over 27 years now, and what we see is cycles. So, if we went back sort of 10, 15 years ago, we saw organizations who were outsourcing, putting things offshore, saying, we don't really want to be, that responsible for our IT, so we're going to move it to an outsourced service provider. We then saw another cycle where everybody was bringing everything back in-house again, on premise. We want to be in control of it. We want to see where our infrastructure is. We want to be able to go and fix it ourselves, and so everything got brought back in-house again. And then we've seen this huge cycle again of again outsourcing, moving things into the cloud, organizations in effect realizing that there's a shortage of skills in the market. There are very, very specialist skills that are required now, and also because technology is becoming so cheap in many respects, actually it's better to have it off-premise with a managed service provider, an organization who basically do this 24/7. They've got all the kit, they've got all the infrastructure, they've got all the specialists, they've got the tools, they can maintain everything, they can make sure that you've got the latest technologies and tools running, and in effect, they're there and they're protecting the systems infrastructure for you. We've also then got wearable technology, we've got artificial intelligence, we've got robotic process automation, we've got blockchain, Bitcoin, all sorts of technology advancement. Digital transformation generally over the last 12 months has started to move very, very quickly. And again, very much as a result of the pandemic, because what we've seen is organizations now saying, how can we use technology more effectively to drive our business, whereby we're less reliant on people? I think one of the things the pandemic has taught us is that actually we need to have a very strong contingency plan. When somebody can't get into a location, or when we've only got half of our workforce who are actually operational, what do? Our business can't just go into the ground. We've got to have something that we can rely on. And in effect, that's going to be technology. So, the future is very much about technology. But what that does is it changes our technology risk landscape very significantly. We've now got an increase in connectivity, access points, remote access. Obviously, we're sharing more data. That can be commercially sensitive data, it can be personal data, and we're sharing that very readily, and we're sharing it very real time. So again, making sure we've got all the right controls and processes in place is really important. Next slide, please, Bella. Thank you. So, why have the cyber attacks increased? Well, obviously, what we do know is the cyber threat landscape has changed quite significantly and globally since the onset of the pandemic. And there's some really obvious reasons for it. When we are in our office environment, when we're in that sort of corporate business environment, actually most organizations have made quite a significant investment in IT over the past few years. Cyber risk, cybersecurity, they're not new terms. The things that we've been dealing with as challenges over the last few years. And as a result of that sort of driving more awareness, many organizations have actually made a significant investment in good security, making sure that, the network is up to date, the infrastructure is up to date, you've got the latest security tools running in the background, making sure you've got the right people in the organization who know how to manage and maintain that. Or actually, as we've said earlier, moving things to an outsourced managed service provider into the cloud, basically giving it to somebody who knows what they're doing. So there have been some significant changes, but obviously what we've now got is we're working in our home environments. Most of us are using our own Wi-Fi. We might be using a kit that's been provided by the organisation. We may not. So you might be running on your own desktop, or you might be using your own mobile phone. You might be logging into your email in a very different way to what you were doing when you were in the office. And what that means is, unfortunately, we don't have that protection that we have when we're in our corporate environment. Most organisations now are becoming very strict as to what you can access and how you access, and you've got to go through sort of the organisational VPN, but that doesn't apply to all businesses. So there is a significant risk with us all working remotely, and also not really knowing what level of security and what the measure of that security is in that environment. The other thing we have as well is obviously the connection. So, whilst IT teams, IT specialists within organisations, cybersecurity leaders are doing everything they can to make sure that, whilst we're working remotely, the business is well protected, and there's a level of awareness, and things are being pushed out to make sure that, so for example, antivirus is up to date and various other things. It still doesn't give you the same level of protection that you would have back in your office environment. So, there are some challenges. We don't know where all of those endpoints are, quite frankly, because people are using lots of different means to be able to continue to work. So, we're relying on this network infrastructure that we've got in our home environments, but we don't really know how secure it is in all means. Thank you, Bella. Okay, Richard, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks, Sheila. Morning all. Let's take a look at some of the cyber stats for 2020, which we have seen carried through to 2021. A staggering amount, 95% of all cybersecurity breaches are caused by human error. And that was down to security and awareness training, which we'll touch on a bit later. Worldwide cybercrime costs should hit 6 trillion annually by 2021. On average, every employee has access to 11 million files. That's also quite staggering. The average cost of a data breach is $3.86 million as of 2020. And then some interesting facts, COVID-19 is credited for a 238% rise in cyber attacks just on banks in 2020. Phishing attacks account for more than 80% of security incidents. So that's obviously social engineering designed to take advantages of human and thus human error. In 2021, there will be 4 million unfilled cybersecurity jobs globally, and cloud-based cyber attacks rose 630% between January and April 2020. And we have seen the cloud cyber attacks continue to rise since the inception of this pandemic. Businesses obviously rushed to move systems to the cloud in order to provide capacity, efficiency, and things for remote access. And that phishing attacks equate to more than 80% of security incidents. Next slide, please, Bella. I won't focus too much on data breach stats from 2010, but just to set the tone, there were some fairly large breaches, but that pale in comparison to the current statistics. For example, Sony suffered a massive breach in its online gaming network, left the names of database addresses and credit card data belonging to 77 million user accounts in one of the largest ever internet security break-ins. Next slide, please, Bella. And as we can see, the data breach landscape now significantly expanded. April 2020, the credentials of 500,000 Zoom accounts were found for sale online on the dark web. In August 2020, researchers at Comparitech uncovered an unsecured database with 235 million Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube user profiles exposed online. November 2020, a database for Mashable.com containing 1.8 million records for staff, users, and subscriber data was leaked. And in Feb 2021, California Department of Motor Vehicles, the DMV, alerted drivers that they had suffered a data breach after a third-party contractor was hit by ransomware. So if we look at some of the COVID-19 stats specifically, this was data extracted from a recent IBM survey. 54% of organizations required major changes to facilitate remote working in response to COVID-19. 76% of participants said that remote work would increase the time to identify and contain a data breach. Estimates show that there have been as many as 192,000 coronavirus-related attacks per week in 2020. Very staggering. Confirmed data breaches in healthcare industry increased by 58% this year. Web application breaches accounted for 43% of all the breaches. A data breach of federal disaster loan applications impacted 8,000 small business owners, and scams increased by 400% over the month of March, making COVID-19 the largest ever security threat. Next slide, please, Bella. Hand over to Sheila.
Thank you. So yeah, some really quite staggering numbers, not hugely surprising given what we said about the changing cyber threat landscape, the fact that we're all in a largely insecure environment, and obviously there are other things happening as well. So, you know, we're dealing with a very unprecedented event. None of us actually knew how to deal with this pandemic. And actually, there's still a huge amount of uncertainty. And what that does is it actually drives certain types of human behaviours. And one of the things that we see, and we've seen for a long time, is that there's this big connection between human behaviour and psychology and cybersecurity. And when you put those things together, you get a better idea of, you know, why is cybersecurity changing so much and how the pandemic has actually affected the cyber threat landscape. So, you know, when we talk about cyber, we often talk about the inherent risk factors, i.e. not the things that are directly related to the technology. So, you know, we do have more routes to data. Of course we do. You know, we're using laptops, iPads, mobile phones, we're downloading things, we're printing things. You know, there's far more data in transit now because we're in a very different environment. We've got this significant thing which is called trust. Now, you know, the thing about cyber and trust is that when you take the psychology of a cyber criminal, what you will find is that when you look back even in history, and more so, more currently as well, is that cyber criminals play on that human trust. So what they will do is their attacks will be very, very targeted, and they'll think very carefully about who they're actually targeting. And, you know, when we say, when Richard just mentioned some of the stats around sort of the pandemic and how so many of them were pandemic related and continue to be so, you know, actually that's because they were basically playing on human trust. So, you know, a lot of the phishing and attacks that we saw, they were basically fronted by organisations like the World Health Organization or the NHS, or, you know, maybe your local GP surgery. They were made to look as if they were coming from a third party who was going to provide individuals with more information about the pandemic. And that in effect is playing on our human tendency of trust. And also actually a lot of these attacks are made to look as if they're coming from either a third party or an individual that you are connected to and have a very close relationship with. So it could be a supplier, it could be an administrator, it could be your bank. As we found over the last few weeks, you know, some of the organisations, DHL, the Post Office, organisations that, you know, we're all very familiar with, they've been around for a long time. We trust those organisations because, you know, we engage with those organisations all the time. So this human tendency of trust is very, very easy for attackers to actually prey on. And, you know, it's about vulnerability. We are distracted, of course we are. You know, there's a lot going on at the moment. You know, there's more opportunities, of course, for individuals to download data. We could potentially be misusing social media, you know, even accidentally, not necessarily knowingly. And actually, because now we've got all of our workforce working in their own home environments, in effect, we do have this situation where not all incidents are potentially being reported. And sometimes when you're outside of that working environment, those policies, those procedures, all of that training, you know, it's easy to forget actually, you know, in this situation, what should I be doing? Who should I be informing? How do I log something? Even maybe recognizing that there's been an incident. We do know that IT staff have been overwhelmed. Generally, there is a shortage of IT skills, not necessarily just in the UK. There's a shortage of IT skills globally, and in effect, that is driving staff to be overwhelmed, but also because staff are having to react, you know, sometimes working in environments where people have been furloughed, people are off sick, so you've already, you know, you've got a shortage of skills. You're trying to keep the lights on, in effect, but at the same time also deal with a lot of new requirements. You know, people might need IT kit that's got to be built and then delivered out to their home environment. You know, people are sort of running out of things, and you know, it's got to be there and delivered to them, and you know, trying to also provide that IT support, which you know has become almost more 24/7 now as well, because we're not necessarily working a 9-to-5 day either. So you know, unfortunately, people can still be the weakest link, and this is why we always maintain education awareness is really, really important, and doing that on more of a continuous basis, as opposed to we've run a session sort of 3 years ago, so hopefully everybody knows what they're doing. Next slide, please, Bella. So, you know, we talk about obviously COVID being a real driver for increased cyber attacks. It's not going to go away. You know, there's still a lot going on. There's still a huge amount of uncertainty. You know, what we've seen is that a lot of these phishing scams that are trying to exploit our concerns about the virus, or you know, are basically using that as a platform. They continue to be extremely successful, and actually we've seen a significant increase in techniques such as phishing and ransomware in particular, and also actually targeted attacks. So you know, over the last few months we've seen a significant increase in charities and in further education, higher education, colleges and universities also being targeted. We know that, you know, across the UK and also across a number of sectors globally, there is a lot of outdated infrastructure out there, and you know, some of it is related to lack of resources, some of it is related to lack of investment and being able to afford to update some of this infrastructure as well. But unfortunately, the cyber criminals are also always one step ahead of us. They know where all the vulnerabilities are. You know, even in a very strong corporate environment, you're trying to keep up with them all the time, making sure your antivirus is up to date, making sure your patching schedules are up to date, making sure that, you know, when Microsoft say, well, this is now out of date, you know, we're going to basically decommission that, it's having that process in place to very quickly then upgrade that infrastructure in your own environment as well. So it is very much an ongoing process. It's not something that you can do once and then move on to something else, because the cyber criminals will always be one step ahead. Next slide, please, Bella.
Thanks, Sheila. As we have understood from the previous 2 slides, is that the people risk is increasing and attackers prey on those vulnerabilities. Cyber attacks are not always targeted. Data that is stolen is leaked and often sold on the black market or the dark web. Hackers will post data leaks and the information or databases or on specific message boards, attracting competitors, marketers, and things like that. Sensitive data is being leaked daily. Data, however, is not always stolen. It's encrypted or rendered inaccessible by ransomware. Hackers demanding a ransom to make the data available again. And it's estimated that a business will fall victim to a ransomware attack every 11 seconds by 2021. So we'll touch on ransomware further down. Next slide, please, Bella.
And then we have third-party risks as well. So this is a really interesting one, because we talk about sort of, you know, a lot of the value of outsourcing, moving things into the cloud, software as a service, managed service providers. We've seen this huge increase in the use of third parties, basically to support, maintain, manage infrastructure and systems. And this is a great thing because, you know, it's cost effective. It means you've got resilience. It means, you know, you don't need to worry about having the specialist skills and tools in house. However, what you're not doing is outsourcing responsibility. So there is still a responsibility on the business to ensure that whatever is being outsourced, that service provision is being managed in a very controlled way. And particularly since the onset of the pandemic, because we have seen more organisations saying, you know, we really need to now move this to a third party. And, you know, we have seen again an increase in managed service and cloud provision, but it's about doing that in a very controlled way, doing your upfront due diligence, making sure that you've got very strict contractual arrangements in place with those third parties, ensuring that you've agreed your KPIs, your key performance indicators and your service level agreements up front, having quarterly assessments, having regular reporting from the third party, and in particular knowing what's being outsourced and how it's being managed and controlled. So if it's data, where is that data going to be located? If you have a requirement for that data to remain in the UK because that's what you're telling your staff or your customers, then in effect you've got to ensure that that's what's agreed with your third party, particularly if it's a cloud service provision and that organisation is using some form of cloud farm, and they could be all over the world, and they generally tend to be all over the world. But it's knowing that, and it's having those agreements and new contractual arrangements as well with the third parties. And also having the right to audit. I can't really stress how important this is. If you are going to outsource anything, build that right to audit within the contractual arrangement, because what that means is every 12 months, you can either go into the organisation or you can request from the organisation that they provide you with, in effect, the same information that you would want to know about when you do your upfront due diligence, or basically have an independent auditor, an independent specialist organisation to go in and do that audit for you. And the idea is, in effect, what you are saying is that you are testing the controls of that organisation because they're looking after your systems, your infrastructure, your data for you. It's in effect no different to if that was in your own organisation. You want to be assured that they have got the right controls and processes in place, and particularly given GDPR as well. So I don't want to turn this into a GDPR session, but the one thing I do want to say is basically the joint liability principle under GDPR. And in very simple terms, what that is basically data controllers and data processors have joint liability over the security of data. So in effect, if you've moved something to a third party organisation, if you've moved your systems, your infrastructure, your data into, say, a cloud-based provision, if that third party was subject to a cyber attack or a data breach, and data which belonged to your organisation or related to your employees, your clients, your customers, your members, if that was also lost as part of that data breach, you could be jointly held liable. So you could also be subject to financial penalties if you weren't able to demonstrate to the regulators that you'd done everything you could to ensure that the third parties, in effect, had a very strong environment of control and processes in place. Thanks, Bella. And just moving on to some of the sort of things you can do to manage those third-party risks, depending on obviously the nature of your organisation and how many third parties you're engaged with. It's always good to maintain a register of those third parties, particularly ones where any form of personal data, personal sensitive data, commercially sensitive data is being shared or managed and supported by that third party organisation. Making sure that you've documented the purpose and the terms under which that data is being shared, i.e. is it being shared because there's a legal basis, or is it being shared under consent? Is all of that formalised and documented? Making sure that third party organisation has got very strict controls and processes in place around GDPR compliance, and you've asked them to demonstrate that, do they have a data security policy in place? Have they got policies in place around their cookies? How often are they doing network vulnerability and penetration testing? Those sorts of basics that you would expect every organisation to have in place. And over and above that, when you're undertaking your own due diligence, you can ask them for some industry recognised standards and certifications as well. So Cyber Essentials Plus, ISO 27001, which is the standard for information security management. You've then got what we call SOC 1, SOC 2, often referred to as AAF or ISA 3402 certifications. And this is basically a certification which an organisation that is providing a service, a third-party service provision, generally they will have these certifications in place, and they're done independently. They're updated every 12 months, and they can simply provide that certification to any customer of theirs that asks for it, either at the stage at which you're engaging with them up front during the contractual negotiations, or even sort of during the course of the contract that you've got in place with them. And generally, because you know, these independent audits take place every 12 months, you would expect them to provide you with that report every 12 months. And then just some of the basics, you know, how often are they testing the resilience of their own systems and environment? You know, they should be doing regular disaster recovery testing. They should be doing regular incident management testing. So if there is an incident at the third party and potentially it does impact on the service that they're providing to you, there's a process in place for them to communicate that to you, communicate it to you in a timely manner. So within your own environment, you can undertake an assessment and determine how does that impact on your business and what do you need to do next. And then obviously I mentioned earlier the right to audit, making sure that's also built into the contract. Next slide, please, Bella.
So now Sheila and Richard have suitably scared you all about the scale and the prevalence of cyber attacks and cyber breaches that we've seen, particularly over the last year. Of course, we know that unfortunately lots of those instances, the whole point of the breach, the whole point of intercepting your systems, intercepting your communication, is about some sort of financial gain. Now, fraud, whether that's cyber enabled or otherwise, is now the most commonly reported crime in the UK. And that's in spite of the fact that we think we only know around about 20% of fraud that is actually committed. Only about 20% of that is ever actually reported to the authorities, to some sort of enforcement body, in order for some action to be taken. And the best estimates out there at the moment suggest that the UK economy loses around £190 billion a year to fraud. And I think there's some sort of misconception that actually a lot of that activity disproportionately affects the public sector. But as you can see from here, almost 75% of that 190 billion are losses from the private sector. And I'm sure most of you around the sort of virtual table today will be familiar with the concept that the private sector is pretty terrible at acknowledging that fraud happens. Of course, the easiest way to be able to report to your shareholders, to your customers, to the public in general, that you haven't identified any fraud in your annual report, in your financial statements, is to stop looking for it. Because if you stop looking for it, you will not find it. But of course, that doesn't mean that it's not there. Again, the best estimates that are out there, and of course we're always talking about estimates when we're talking about fraud, because we know it's woefully unreported and we know that it's not identified anywhere near to the extent that we would like it to be. But the best estimates out there suggest that most businesses will lose somewhere between 1 and 5% of their budget every year to fraud, whether or not they acknowledge that risk. Now, unfortunately, any time of change, any time of crisis, any sort of emergency situation is an opportunity for a fraudster. Sheila and Richard have both already touched upon the fact that our processes, have changed drastically over the last year. Our attention has needed to be elsewhere, whether that's making sure that our business can continue to run remotely, whether that's making sure that our health and well-being of our staff is being properly protected, whether that's making sure that we're able to homeschool our children at the same time as do our job, means that our attention is elsewhere. And there's lots of sort of added confusion into the mix, which just allows fraudsters an opportunity to take advantage of the situation that we're in. And I think we all anticipated a really drastic increase in cyber fraud targeting both businesses and individuals when the pandemic hit. And again, I'm sure that everybody who's dialed into the session today will personally have received a text or an email scam, much like those over on the next slide, please, Bella. Whether that's suggesting that we're entitled to some sort of benefit or some sort of reimbursement because of the pandemic, whether it's that we're being fined for non-compliance with lockdown measures, or maybe it's even just something to do with the fact that, of course, our online shopping practices have increased so drastically over the last year. This, I think, on this slide is what we all anticipated that fraud in a global pandemic would look like. But what I've seen and what a lot of my clients over the past year have been shocked about is around the other ways that they've been targeted by fraudsters. It's really disappointing, but something that we have to acknowledge, that COVID-19 has essentially created a whole new pool of fraudsters. We now have suppliers whose cash flows have run dry over the past year. They haven't been able to deliver the work that they would usually. They haven't been able to bill you and your clients for the work that they would have been able to usually. We've got reams of staff who've been plunged into financial hardship that they were not expecting and that they still might not know how they're going to get out of. And of course, unfortunately, a lot of those individuals and a lot of those organisations will now be looking to recover their losses. And that might cause them to act in a way that they perhaps never would have anticipated before, in terms of the level of dishonesty or deception that they might need to rely on in order to rebalance the books, as it were. So as the pandemic has raged on, I've become increasingly concerned about those fraud risks that are either totally new because of COVID, or those fraud risks that we perhaps knew about that have been quite significantly exacerbated by COVID, but that are much less explicit than these scams that come through that we're all to a certain extent quite alert to now. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time this morning just sort of unpicking some of those risks, COVID risks, business risks that actually represent a significant fraud risk to yourselves and to your clients. Next slide, please, Bella. So one of the first things that I think most businesses have seen happen this year is an increase in sickness absence, whether that's because individuals have been affected by COVID, whether that's because individuals are in quarantine or in isolation or have care commitments. For whatever reason, staff have been away from work much more over the past year than have done previously. And that doesn't just result in a risk around productivity or in a risk around delivery. It might result in increased recruitment activity or the use of temporary staff to an extent that you've never had to do that before. And you might have needed to engage those staff quickly. And so you might have been less rigorous around the verification measures and the due diligence that you apply to staff or even temporary staffing providers. It might mean that staff who are responsible for your payroll might have found it a little bit easier to set up 2 records on the payroll system when you have a new starter, with that second wage going straight into their bank account. You might see less scrupulous or perhaps more desperate temporary staffing agencies inflating hourly rates, adding hours onto timesheets, submitting duplicate or even entirely counterfeit invoices coming through your system for payment. And unfortunately, we've also seen lots of examples of staff undertaking other work when they've been furloughed, when they've been shielding, when they've been self-isolating, or when they've been on sickness absence. And even when those people have been receiving significant enhancements from their employer, from the government, in order to support them during this time. And on the next slide, we have a case study of one of those methodologies coming to fruition. So a temporary member of staff within a HR team at one of my clients added a ghost record onto the payroll. She initially diverted those extra salary payments to her own bank account. And when she realised that that had worked, about 6 weeks later, she started to add additional people onto the payroll until we had 6 extra members of staff, temporary staff, on this organisation's payroll. It wasn't until we were able to deploy some data analytics with this client that we realised the extent of the problem and how many individuals she'd added onto the system. And in a really short space of time, she'd already overpaid herself through that methodology by over £50,000. What we saw was, of course, her reliance when this went through the criminal justice system on debts, a really difficult financial position. That was why she felt the need to do it, because she was in a temporary role. She didn't know how long that was going to last, and some unfortunate family situations that she relied upon. But actually, the £50,000 far exceeded her debts and her financial commitments. And we were able to establish that actually she'd just been really extensively living beyond her means during that time. I'm really pleased in that particular circumstance to see this individual receive a prison sentence, which is quite unusual for a female fraudster, particularly a parent as well. Thinking about Some of the other risks that have presented themselves over the last year might be an urgent need for goods or services. Over onto the next slide, please, Bella. Now, these goods or services will mean different things to different organisations for you and for your clients, but it probably means that you've had to engage with new suppliers, and those new suppliers might not have had the capability, they might not have had the credentials, or in some cases, I think the government have seen over the last few months, they might not even have had the stock that they claimed to have had in order to engage with you. A desire to keep the supply chain moving, government direction to pay suppliers more quickly than usual. Both of those things might mean that you're not able to verify your invoices as closely as you would usually to make sure that they're genuine, to make sure that they're accurate. You might see fraudsters, we've seen quite a drastic increase in fraudsters using all the information that's in the public domain about the contracts that have been awarded as a result of COVID in order to be able to intercept communications with you, with other organisations, to be able to say, actually, you know, you've just set up a contract with this particular supplier, here's our bank account information that we'd like you to use. Lots of organisations as well have had to rely on credit cards more so than they would have done previously, whether that's to make purchases quickly, remotely, out of hours. And of course, what we've all tried to do is keep those balances clear so that we can continue to make those urgent purchases when we need to. So we've paid off credit cards quickly, and perhaps again with less rigorous verification of statements and supporting information than we would have done usually. And again, on the next slide, please, Bella, we've got another case study of fraud in a supply chain, an individual who set up essentially an inappropriate relationship with quite a specialist supplier, diverting that contract, a really high value contract, to that particular supplier in exchange for a really substantial bribe. He was able to do this by making sure that all of the invoices that came through for this particular contract were diverted to him directly, at a level that they wouldn't be picked up but for scrutiny by anybody else. And so that nobody else ever had any control over this particular contract or any oversight of this individual's relationship with the supplier. A little bit unfortunate in this instance that this individual perhaps might not have been apprehended if it wasn't for the fact that he was under investigation for what's referred to, let's refer to it as an inappropriate relationship with somebody in relation to a temporary staffing company. And it was only through a rigorous investigation of this individual's corporate email account that we were able to identify that this had happened. And again, some quite significant prison sentences there, which is a really good deterrent to send back out to staff. And then lastly, on the next slide, what we've definitely seen across the majority of clients that we work with over the last year is that unfortunately organisations have had to pare back or to suspend or to streamline their governance processes in order to get business done. Business critical matters have had to be the focus over the past year. And when we couple that with this increased absence rate amongst staff, what you see is individuals within organisations acting with much more autonomy and far less oversight than they probably did 2 years ago. We've already seen from a couple of the case studies I've referenced so far that within your business, within your clients, within any organisation, unfortunately, individuals will use these opportunities to exploit conflicts of interest, to award contracts inappropriately, to find ways to bolster their own income, particularly when they continue to be faced with uncertainty about the security of their jobs going forward, or their supply chain, their income going forward. And then just one more case study over the slide, please, Bella. Thank you. So this is actually an example of the methodology I referred to a moment ago around the supplier setup stage. So much information out in the public domain about contracts having been awarded, that this particular fraudster was able to identify that a construction contract had been awarded to a quite well-known supplier, and the client had set up their system in order to be able to make a number of interim payments to that construction provider over the course of the contract. And it wasn't until partway through the delivery of that contract that the supplier threatened to withdraw their services that the client realised that those interim payments had been directed elsewhere from the very outset of that contract. So that contract award notification had gone into the public domain in order to maintain anti-competitive practices. and a supplier, a fraudster, sorry, had intercepted those communications, sent through information to the client in order for those payments to be diverted to themselves. And by the time this was identified, £500,000 had already been paid to that fraudulent bank account, and of course have then been dissipated amongst a number of international bank accounts with no real opportunity for those monies to be paid back to the client. Now, we know that during the last recession, fraud increased threefold, and we now know that this financial crisis is going to be worse. So organisations, whatever sector they're in, whatever type of work it is they're delivering, need to be prepared for these enhanced risks to continue for some time. Next slide, please, Bella. So there's a few thoughts on here in terms of what organisations should be doing. And again, this applies to any organisation, any sector, any business, to try and make sure that you are prepared as possible for this continued control environment as far as you possibly can, but also making sure that your control environment is sufficiently robust for the changes that you've implemented with your processes. Regularly auditing, sample checking, using data analytics wherever you can to quickly identify where fraud may already have targeted your organisation. And Sheila and Richard have already touched upon, and we're going to come back around to, staff awareness, making sure that everybody within your organisation, within your clients' organisations, know and are properly prepared to raise concerns when they see something that they think is inappropriate, when they see something that isn't right, because their ability to do that, their capability, their capacity, and their permission to do that within an organisation can absolutely be the difference between an attempted fraud and a successful one. And then just onto the last slide, Bella, there's just a few thoughts for you to take away with you today in terms of things that you might want to think about for your own business and things that you might want to think about for your clients as well, in terms of how they tackle these issues currently to keep businesses afloat, but also how they might like to be prepared to deal with these sorts of concerns and these sorts of risks going forward.
Thanks, Gemma. As we have seen as a theme throughout this presentation, is that 95% of all data breaches and cyber attacks are the result of human error or the attacker's reliance on the human trust factor and social engineering. So social engineering is a blanket term for the set of techniques used to psychologically manipulate or deceive people into performing actions or divulging information. Social engineering, like many scams, exploits the natural human tendency to trust, and hackers and attackers use social engineering techniques to trick their way into secured systems and networks to obtain access to passwords, bank account information, sensitive or personal commercial data as well, and even install malware onto your computer. Many cyber attacks use techniques such as USB drop, where they would drop a USB device outside an office. Someone then picks the device up and is very curious to see what is inside or what is on that device, and plugs it into their laptop, only to have malware spread throughout the environment. Next slide, please, Bella. Here we have an example of a phishing email. The email appears to have come from a John Smith at HSBC. However, upon closer inspection, it's actually HSCB. This probably isn't the best example. There are many emails that are crafted with corporate logos designed to trick the victim. Things to watch out for are, is the email address valid? Is the email addressed, worded and signed as you would expect? And note the urgency of the email as well. Adding urgency to an email creates panic, increasing the chances that the victim will rush to ensure that the payment is made or instruction is followed without following proper procedure or security protocol. Next slide, please, Bella. The different types of malware distribution. So we have ransomware, and ransomware is used to blackmail or to hold data to ransom. Once infected, it will spread quickly across your network environment or infrastructure, encrypting data, rendering it inaccessible, until the decryption keys are provided, usually for a monetary value, such as Bitcoin. Often it can also encrypt the backup locations as well, so making recovery very hard or virtually impossible. Spyware and adware, this infects machines to either steal data, credentials, or to spam you with adverts or marketing. Botnets. Botnets are usually installed along with freeware applications. For example, you install that free PDF tool that allows you to convert a PDF file to a Word document. A botnet is then bundled with this application, and it runs silently in the background until such time as the hacker needs your computer's resources. The hacker then uses it to create a targeted denial of service attack, or it uses it to scan the internet for vulnerable data. And hackers like using these because firewall systems will generally block malicious type traffic if it comes from a specific IP address. Obviously, if it's coming from a bunch of addresses around the world, it's much harder for a firewall to block these types of intrusion. And all of these types of malware are engineered as types of viruses, worms, or Trojans. Next slide, please, Bella. So what can you do to mitigate risk? Let's take a look at the key elements to aid in mitigating risk. Governance, ensure that policy and procedures are effectively developed and communicated to all staff and third parties as well. Ensure adherence to these policies and that they are reviewed. Give you the ability to create a roadmap to fixing or addressing the vulnerabilities. For example, a Cyber Essentials certification aims to ensure that the basics are in place for cybersecurity, and then performing a cyber maturity assessment based on ISO 27001 or the NIST framework offer even further value, going over and above the basics into gauging maturity on identifying, detecting, preventing, responding and recovering from attacks or breaches as well. Threat modeling will help you to understand your IT assets and what risks those assets face, what is the likelihood of an incident happening, and what could be the impact of a security event. Penetration testing is a great way to examine your environment, and it should be tested regularly. It will help to highlight the vulnerabilities that are open on any system, and understanding open vulnerabilities ensures that they can be addressed, or extra controls of security can be implemented around to protect those assets as well. Phishing exercises and testing. It's a great way to educate the workforce and to assess the level of maturity towards cybersecurity as well. Ongoing and regular testing is vital. 95% of attacks are human error, so it makes sense to focus on training and upskilling staff, creating security and awareness. There is training out there that does role-based training as well. So there's training based for data owners, for management that require oversight for information security, and then your standard training for the standard workforce as well. Next slide, please, Bella. With regards to cyber risk, what questions should you be asking? Analyze areas of the business for risk, implement plans to mitigate that risk, ensure that your incident management plan includes not only detection, but response and recovery, and that it is effectively developed as well, and ensure that you have a process to manage third parties effectively. What provisions have you made so far to ensure that your business remains secure and robust? Have you provided any additional communications to warn users, to train them against phishing attacks or cold callers or trends that are in the market at current? If one of your key third parties suffers an attack, how detrimental will the impact be on the business right now? So are you in a position to respond and to recover from one of those attacks? And are effective incident management processes in place to quickly communicate effectively with staff, third parties, and customers? So what we've seen is organizations usually focus on the defense side, but when something happens, people are usually scrambling around to follow the correct process. So it is a good idea to ensure that your incident management processes are effective as well. Thank you.
Well, thanks, guys. Really interesting stuff there. Hopefully we haven't scared everyone too much, but it's certainly raised some awareness. We've had a few questions through, which I'll quickly run through now. First one, what are the biggest challenges that you face as a business in managing cyber security?
I think if I just start there, Justin, you know, as you can see, sort of the combined risk that we've got with both cyber and fraud increasing. You know, I think if we sort of went back 10 years ago, it was in some respects easier to identify a fraud because, you know, a lot of what was happening was very manual and it was, you know, it was a lot more traceable. Is that fair, Gemma? You know, now, because we're all working in this very digital world and actually everything is being driven by tools and technology and data, actually you know, there's a lot more opportunity for people to undertake fraud utilising that technology, but also in many respects, you know, it can be harder to identify and it can potentially take longer to identify as well. So, you know, the opportunities have increased and actually there's a lot more information there to give people that opportunity to conduct that fraud easily as well. And then, you know, as we say, we've got this big risk of the changing cyber threat landscape as well. So, you know, not only are we trying to manage all of the challenges of the pandemic, you know, remote working, maybe fewer people, you know, lack of skills, and you know, we've probably changed our control environment, lack of segregation of duties. We're sort of, you know, giving people more responsibility than they've had in the past, but there's still got to be that overlay of process and control and monitoring, because otherwise, you know, it's going to be a bit of a free for all, really.
Okay, thanks. Just a quick one. How common is ransomware?
I think about 2 years ago, there was a large spout of ransomware, WannaCry, and I know it attacked the NHS and they were affected by it quite severely. And we saw ransomware drop off. But with the onset of this pandemic, it has definitely returned and it's expected to continue going forward as well. We've had recent attacks with ransomware. There was the large one that affected Microsoft Exchange servers around the world. That was labeled Hafnium, a group that infected email servers with DearCry, another form of the WannaCry ransomware virus. And we've had a lot of clients that have reported ransomware attacks recently as well. So ransomware is definitely back. It will stay. And ransomware takes advantages of the vulnerabilities that exist in an organization's infrastructures. So if there's no effective patch management, again, security and awareness training as well, if the staff are not clued up with looking towards avoiding ransomware, it will definitely get onto your environment and spread like wildfire through the environment as well. And then another thing that we've seen as a trend is that the ransomware has been able to jump onto backup storage locations. So organizations haven't had enough security controls around blocking off or segregating the backup locations from the existing live data locations. So once ransomware gets onto your environment, it can encrypt your live data plus the backups, making recovery very, very hard.
Thanks. That probably have to be the last question, I think, now. Is there any data that compares the UK experience of data fraud with other countries? Any volunteers for that one?
I think I'll probably pass that across to Gemma. Gemma, have we got anything where we can do sort of a comparison between different territories and regions from a fraud perspective?
Yes, absolutely. There's some quite good research that comes out on an annual basis by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners that looks at the UK versus the international picture. And actually it's something we can circulate a link to after the event if that would be helpful.
Brilliant. Well, thank you guys, and thank you everyone for logging in. As usual, please do update your preferences so that we can keep you up to date with everything, and look out for future invites for the next session. Thanks a lot.